So I'm here to introduce Sam. So I'll just tell you if you don't already know, Sam is a fourth-year biomath student. He along with Professor Marcus Roper, with a little bit of assistance from myself, he's been working on numerical methods for simulating, particle motion in microfluidic channels. And, I'm excited for him to present some results here, and I look forward to hearing from him. So, okay, Sam, I guess take it away.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Chris. Okay, so thank you everyone for coming. Yeah, let's get started. So microfluidic devices are devices used by bioengineers for controlled manipulation of nanoliter-sized volumes of liquid, along with the particles and individual cells carried within them. In particular, nowadays, microfluidic devices, much like the ones you see, or the one demonstrating the schematic on screen, on the screen, go sufficiently fast that the inertia of the background flow actually becomes really relevant in sort of pushing the particles around. And so in particular, the disturbances generated by these particles as they're flowing through the initial microfluidic devices cause the particles to focus to certain positions in the channel, as demonstrated in this cross-section view here, and to also have very particular spacing. And these two features have gotten a lot of use from bioengineers who want to sort of separate two cells. So you can imagine a common use case is that it can be used to focus cancer cells from blood cells, because the cancer cells tend to be larger, which makes them affect the background flow differently. And so you have differential focusing. So on the right, we sort of have 2 or 3 designs that try to sort of exploit this asymmetry. You have sort of a channel that's asymmetric, a bendy channel, and then a full-on spiral channel. This third one is actually, this is the design in a device that's used to try to, as a first round cancer test, as like a very simple, cheap cancer test. And so the idea is just that because the different cells are of different sizes, they will focus to different parts of the channel. And so these devices are very creative, and they're mostly designed based on insight and lots of grinding from graduate students, because currently there's very little predictive science as to what will actually, or there is predictive science, but the predictive science isn't used very much as to like where the particles will actually focus to. And so the reason why it's not used very much is because it's actually much more expensive to run the simulations than it is to simply just build a channel and have your graduate student do tests on it for a couple weeks. So if you imagine you just have some arbitrarily shaped channel here, you have a pretty complex channel. If I just asked you where the focusing points would be, no one could really say for sure, because it's really sort of an unintuitive system for how it can come out. And so if you wanted to simulate this using like just a straight up like Navier-Stokes solver that's hooked up to particle motion, just getting one trajectory of one particle could take up to 10 hours, because it's a nonlinear problem with a complicated constraint that you have to abide by. And it just takes a really long time to solve. So you can imagine if you wanted to try particles of different sizes coming in from a bunch of different places, the scaling gets bad really quickly. Whereas if you just build your device, sure, it takes 12 hours of work, and you also, the tools required to create one of these devices are actually pretty expensive to have. But once you have the tools, the devices aren't that hard to make. And then you can just run thousands and thousands of particles through it, and then have your graduate student look at all the data and see what happens. And so our goal here is to develop a method that can solve this problem really efficiently and quickly. So that way people can try to use sort of this predictive tool to help design their devices to be better and help optimize them along some of their many different parameters. Okay, so here are sort of the full equations of motion. We have the nonlinear Navier-Stokes equations along with their divergence-free condition, no slip walls in the boundary. And then this third one It just says that there's a rigid body motion on the surface of the particle, and that the motion has to be chosen such that the particle remains force and torque free with respect to the fluid. And so you have this nonlinear three-dimensional partial differential equation hooked up to this difficult to enforce condition where you have to solve and then check and then resolve and check and resolve and check. And you can see how it would take a while. So our goal is to try to simplify this. So first, we're just going to non-dimensionalize it. Here is the conservation of momentum equation in its non-dimensionalized form. You can see all those parameters just get reduced to one, which is called the Reynolds number. So the Reynolds number represents a ratio of inertial to viscous forces. So the higher the Reynolds number, the more strong the inertial forces are. So you can imagine sort of in big, fast flows, the inertial or the Reynolds number is very high, whereas in small, slow flows, it's very low. So these devices are actually, even though they're 100 microns in width, they're actually run at such high speeds because they want to do high throughput tests that the Reynolds number is actually around 100. And so it's much too large to try to ignore the nonlinearity in the system. And so sort of the key insight here is that instead of trying to solve for the flow in the channel, we reframe the problem to be about the disturbance to the flow caused by the presence of the particle. Okay. Because the particle is small, the disturbance should be small as well, which will allow for an accurate linearization and approximation. And so here we do just that mathematically. We let U prime be the disturbance flow, which is just literally the difference between the flow with the particle and the flow without the particle, here represented by U bar. Okay, and then we also transform our equations to sort of reflect these velocity and size scales. So we transform the equation to, instead of being the velocity is non-dimensionalized by the maximum velocity in the channel, it's non-dimensionalized by the maximum disturbance velocity in the channel, which is just basically the difference in the difference in velocity measured from the top of the particle to the bottom of the particle. And also the size scale is adjusted to be that of the particle. And so here we have our new equation down here, which looks mostly the same, right? You pick up a couple terms because you're doing this sort of different scheme and plugging it into a bilinear term. But what you end up here is, instead of the Reynolds number, you have the Reynolds particle number, right? Which is equal to a squared over L squared times the Reynolds number. A squared here is the radius of the particle, or I'm sorry, A is the radius of the particle. L is the length scale of the channel. And so A is much smaller than L. Typically it's smaller than like 1/10. So this allows for, even for channels with much larger Reynolds number, the Reynolds particles number is lower, which allows for more accurate linearizations and approximations. So we want to do a bit more transformations of the coordinate system before we start doing our analytical work. So we also move to a moving reference frame and then plug in sort of what's called the centered background flow. Essentially, you sort of view the background flow also in the moving reference frame. And we arrive at our final equation before we start simplifying. So this equation might seem more complicated, but if you look closely, you see sort of how the small parts are sort of separated from the parts we want to actually look at. And the small parts here happen to be the more complicated parts, right? So you see how this UP here represents the particle migration or the migration velocity of the particle, whereas U bar represents the background flow. These terms end up not canceling exactly, but becoming very small, typically negligible. This term here, which is the nonlinear portion of the background flow applied to the background flow, it's much smaller because it's the disturbance flow is much smaller than the background flow. So this term becomes much smaller than these two terms, so we can ignore the nonlinear part. You sort of can see how this is going. So what we want to do now is to search for approximate solutions of this PDE. We want to separate the domain into two regions, an inner region where the effects of the particle dominate, and an outer region where the inertia of the background flow interacts with the disturbance caused by the inner region, or caused within the inner region, to generate a particle migration. Okay, so we're looking close to the particle. We expand it. So we expand it in two different ways, actually. First, with respect to Reynolds particle number, and second, with respect to particle size. Alpha here is the dimensionless ratio between particle size and channel size. And so once again, because we're looking close to the particle, our coordinate system is, every time we increase the power of x, we add an extra power of alpha to things. So we can see here, this is essentially just like a Taylor approximation of the background flow centered at the particle. And you just see the linear term is most relevant. So when we take all the simplifications and we just look for the first order solution, we actually just get Stokes flow with rigid body motion and a shear gradient, which is actually solvable analytically. Yeah, the solution is listed here. You can sort of imagine this as the particle it's able to flow and rotate with the fluid, but it is unable to shear with the fluid. And that's sort of why this shear condition here is sort of the first order thing that comes up. So we see we have the solution. So this solution, it's a more complicated, that's what I'm looking for, fraction of polynomials. The main idea though is that it decays like 1 over r squared. Okay, so this decay is what's going to decay into this decay of the disturbance flow is going to go into the outer region, interact with the inertia and interact with the inertia of the background flow, and then generate a migration velocity. So this is sort of the back of the envelope calculation for how we pick the size, the length scale away from the particle on what this happens. You just balance the viscous stress of the solution we just calculated with the inertial stress of the solution we just calculated, line them up, and then solve for what the expected length scale we have to be away from the particle, where the disturbance flow is of the same order as the background velocity. And this ends up being where we pick up our factor of Reynolds particle number and arrive at basically our linearized Navier-Stokes equations in this case. So here, all we did is we expanded once again in the outer region. We expanded our solution, and then we collected terms of the order we'd expect from the previous calculation that where we estimated the lengths and size scales of things. And so here's what we get. This is called the Oseen equation. It's actually linear. U bar here, remember, represents the background flow, which is the flow in the channel without the presence of the particle. And the way that this is matched to the inner region is just through this boundary condition here. We say as the outer region approaches the origin, its solution must approach that of the inner region. Okay. So here's sort of a picture of what's going on. The orange here represents the inertial forces, or the outer region where inertia balances viscous stresses, and the blue represents the inner region. And you can see the whole goal is that the outer region is where the migration velocity is generated, and it is generated due to its interaction with the inner region through this boundary condition. So this formulation is sort of a higher dimensional generalization of that originally given by Schoenberg and Hinch. So here is where we sort of I start to add in my original work. So this is not actually the only solution of this order. If you look at one order higher in the inner region, you get something that, while it may be smaller because it's one order higher with respect to Reynolds number, in the outer region, it's actually exactly the same size because it doesn't decay, unlike the first order solution. Okay. And so when you solve for this solution, you get a really, really complicated function. It's a 3D discontinuity equation, or it's a 3D discontinuity at the origin. Here's one component written. I didn't write all three because it would take 3 pages and it's not important. The point is, though, is that there's a big discontinuity at the origin, at the location of the particle, which really affects numerical solvers, because you're trying to approximate this thing with a polynomial basis. And you have a discontinuity right where you're trying to measure the migration velocity. And so to try to fix this, what we do is we decompose the solution into a continuous, a singular, and a discontinuous part, and then reformulate the problem into a new PDE, which, while it may look more complicated, it's the exact same PDE, just with a more complicated right-hand side. And this allows for us to, instead of solving for the discontinuous solution, we solve for a continuous solution, as demonstrated here. So on the left, you see the solution without the discontinuity approximation, or I'm sorry, without the discontinuity decomposition. The solution is discontinuous because you haven't gotten rid of it beforehand. And on the right, you see with the discontinuity solution, where the solution ends up being is continuous, because we had a priori knowledge of the discontinuity and were able to solve around it. So this actually has like huge impact on the speed at which you can solve things. Here in yellow, you see with the discontinuity decomposition, it ends up being a higher order of convergence, and also it's more stable as well at less dense grid sizes. So it's really an all-around benefit compared to previous methods of solving this equation for particle migration velocity. Next, so we're sort of going to get into results inside of microfluidics channels. And so just as a reminder, the way that focusing worked is this whole time we were solving for migration velocity. And so the way that migration velocity works is you put the particle at a point, like let's say here, and you solve for the migration. I don't think you can see my cursor. Anyway, you pick an area, you put the particle at a point, and a migration velocity is generated. Here it's represented by one of these arrows. And so the particle then migrates in that direction, right? This is, as a reminder, this is in the cross-section view. So you're sort of looking down the pipe of the channel. And so you have all these arrows that form a 2D vector field, right? And the particle just is pushed around by this 2D vector field. This 2D vector field here, or in subfigure B, we have the plot, or the streamlines, or not streamlines. We have the trajectories of the particles as viewed in the cross-section view. So if a particle starts here, the migration velocity would end up focusing it along this path to this black spot, right? And in figure D, you see the basins of attraction. So if you start in the yellow basin, you will end up at that black equilibrium spot inside the yellow basin. And that's how you look at figure D. And so I spent a while just sort of playing around with funny channel designs. I did a lot. If anyone has any experience with if UCLA is litigious about putting their what's it called, logo and things, please let me know, because I've gotten mixed answers about that. But yeah, so you can see the things in this, or the channels in this diagram are very complicated. You know, most of them way more complicated than anything you could actually simulate, or anything you could actually create in the real world. But the code is able to simulate them accurately and quickly. Each of these took under a couple hours. Some of them took like 10 minutes. Really, the UCLA one is the only one that took a few hours. All the others were quite fast. But so applying this to real channels, we compared results to a paper by Wani Lee and Dino DiCarlo, and it agrees in channels of multiple shapes. And what we're working on is we've sort of assembled this into a package. And the idea is that we're, along with our publication, we're going to release the package, and hopefully bioengineers will use our tool to be able to more quickly calculate how they should change their microfluidic channel in order to better suit their whatever their test purposes is, to create better separation between cancer cells and regular cells, for example. So in the future, we would like to sort of create, right now the geometry constraints are sort of limited. I showed that picture where it's all the different shapes, but this calculation requires it to have a constant cross section. So it couldn't have any of those curvy designs that we saw at the beginning. So next, I'd like to generalize it to where you have sort of a curved channel. And then if we were able to find sort of higher respects to alpha and REP, you could get better accuracy for this distinguished focusing between small and large particles and the effects of increasing and decreasing the speed at which they throw through the channel, and also how multiple particles interact with each other, because spacing is also another thing that's really important for how these bioengineers perform their experiments in the microfluidic devices. Yeah, and that's the end of my talk. Thank you for listening.